Hello and welcome to Taiwan Talks. I'm Ian Kavat. Today I speak exclusively to Liz Truss, a former British Prime Minister and Foreign Secretary, as she visits Taiwan for the first time. She held the highest office for more than 40 days. Truss is the highest ranking British MP to visit Taiwan since Margaret Thatcher in 1996. Her message is the world must act now to counter an increasingly aggressive China, and she sets out ways to do that. Let's take a look. Liz Truss, former British Prime Minister and Foreign Secretary, welcome to Taiwan Talks.
Great to be here.
I understand you are enjoying your freedom, so how does it feel to be in Taiwan?
It's great. As you know, because of the various protocols, UK government ministers, certainly cabinet ministers, aren't really able to travel to Taiwan. But it's something I've always wanted to do. Taiwan is a beacon of freedom and democracy. I'm a great believer that we need to make sure that Taiwan's able to defend itself, that we build free societies and support free societies around the world. So it's great to be able to come here and see it in real life and experience the commerce, the industry, the buzz that there is here.
Now, China's envoy to the UK has called your trip a dangerous political show which will do nothing but harm to the UK. Do you read that as a threat?
What I read this as is Beijing and the Chinese Communist Party trying to prevent people visiting Taiwan, engaging with Taiwan, talking about Taiwan. And we know why that is. It's because President Xi has been very clear that his ambition is to take over Taiwan. So he wants to do that in the way that causes the least disruption as possible. And I don't believe we should accept the rhetoric from the Chinese Communist Party in the free world. Instead, we should be actively seeking to engage Taiwan, bring Taiwan into the conversation and celebrate what is a free democracy 80 miles away from a totalitarian regime, which is what China has regrettably become.
But some in the British press have also criticised your visit. They say that you are using Taiwan to rebuild your career. Are you?
Well, again, I would say of my friends in the British press, they benefit from operating in a free society, which people in China don't benefit from. And I just think the press have got to be very careful about repeating the lines to take of the Chinese Communist Party. What we know is that the Chinese Communist Party uses misinformation and disinformation to try and discredit their opponents, those who believe in free societies. And I just don't think we should have any truck with any of the propaganda they spout.
So critics of high-level visitors to Taiwan will say that the visits are purely symbolic and they don't bring real benefits to Taiwan. What's your view on visits per se?
Well, I've been invited by the Taiwan authorities, and I believe that they are in a position to understand what is best from a Taiwanese perspective. But the reason I've come is after 10 years of not being able to visit Taiwan, I wanted to see for myself what things are like here, what the people of Taiwan want, what the authorities want, so that we are able to work more closely with Taiwan. And I don't believe, if you've never visited a country or you've never visited a democracy like Taiwan, how can you know what's happening here? And that is the deliberate intention of the Chinese Communist Party, is to stop that happening, to stop people having that experience, to stop them being able to engage. And again, to me, this is part of a propaganda effort, and we should ignore that.
You said Taiwan is the most consequential place in the world, in the most consequential struggle of our time. Could you explain what this means?
Well, we're facing a real threat to freedom and democracy. 30 years ago, more people lived in democracies than they do today. And I find that very worrying. We've now got China is the world's largest economy on a purchasing parity power basis, growing its armaments, growing its military, growing its economic influence around the world. I believe there is a threat to the future of freedom and democracy. And if you look at that threat and what the tipping point could be, Taiwan is very, very important. Of course, it's important because it's a free democracy and we support people in free democracies, and I want people in Taiwan to live happy, free lives where they're able to decide their own futures rather than being told what to do. I think that's important in itself. But it's also important because of the shipping routes in the Taiwan Strait. It's important because of the critical mineral supplies that the global economy depends on. And it's important because of the huge signal it would send if China were successful in taking over Taiwan. Now, I've been on the inside as I've seen the build-up to the war in Ukraine. And I think what we all recognise now in the West is we didn't do enough early enough. Putting more economic controls on Russia, which we should have done. Not allowing Russia to do things like attend the G8. Failing to respond adequately when there were incursions in Crimea or when there were support for action in the Donbass. We didn't do enough. And we're now facing the consequences. When I say we're facing the consequences, it's actually the people of Ukraine who are facing the dreadful consequences of that. So this is why I'm so exercised that we need to do more as we can see this emerging threat to take action before it is too late and before the situation gets worse.
And yet politicians like Macron, Emmanuel Macron, President of France, says essentially Taiwan is not a core interest for Europe.
I completely disagree with that. I think that's wrong. That if we look at the threat to freedom and democracy across the world, the number one threat is an increasingly powerful totalitarian China. And supporting the free democracy 80 miles from the coast from China is to me a vital part of making sure China doesn't succeed in its ambitions. And let's be clear, those ambitions aren't just territorial, they're ideological. President Xi wants to promote a different way of life to the one that we believe in. A top-down, controlling, coercive version of the world, not a free, bottom-up, democratic, people-led version of the world. And I think that's wrong. And I think we've got to be clear about that. It doesn't matter that Taiwan is in a different part of the world. It hasn't stopped China interfering in European politics, the fact that we're at the other side of the world. And likewise, the war in Ukraine is having knock-on effects for people here in the Pacific. Of course it is. We can't just ignore a problem just because it's far away.
So you say that there is no choice, the world has no choice about whether there is a Cold War because China has already made up its mind. And you say that the only choice we have is either to appease and accommodate China or to take action to prevent conflict. So which countries do you view as appeasing and accommodating China?
I think to some extent, every or virtually every country in the free world is not doing enough at the moment. I think we've moved. I think things are better than they were in the so-called golden era, where we were actively seeking closer economic ties with China. But it's still the case that technology is being exported to China, which is being used against its own citizens. It's still the case that we don't have a coordinated group of countries that is clear on its economic action vis-a-vis China. So I think we all need to do more. And what I've been saying today is really a call to action for the free world of, yes, measures have been taken, but we need to do more, and we need to be more coordinated. Because the Chinese Communist Party is very adept at playing one country off against another, or even trying to exacerbate internal divisions within countries. And we need to be very alive to that and aware of that. And we need to work together, because what we have in common, our way of life, our belief in freedom and democracy, is more important than any internal divisions that we have.
So one of your policies, suggested policies, is an economic NATO. Can you tell us how this would work?
So during the Cold War, there was a Committee on Exports, which was a group of countries that had a common policy on their exports towards the Soviet Union. What I want to see is a grouping of countries that has a common policy on technology exports towards China, action in the case of economic coercion. So we've seen Australia subject to economic coercion, we've seen Lithuania subject to economic coercion. So this would be a coordinating response in the event of economic coercion by China. This committee could take action with all of those countries involved. And if you look at what we've done on an ad hoc basis already with Russia, a group of countries has come together to put sanctions on Russia. So that's the G7, the EU, plus allies like South Korea, Australia. What I'm saying is, rather than waiting for something bad to happen, instead we should preemptively establish such a grouping so that we are able to show that we're serious. And I think that will help deter conflict. I think prevention is better than cure. It's better to show we're ready, it's better to show we're coordinated, and not have any beggar my neighbour policies between free countries, but instead have a coordinated approach.
In the US, there was a bill that was put forward called the Taiwan Policy Act. And in there, some of the congressmen had suggested sanctions, economic sanctions against China in order to deter an invasion, and it didn't get through. What sort of likelihood or what sort of appetite are you feeling amongst the people that you talk to, for establishing this sort of mechanism?
Well, I think there are differences of opinion on this issue, but we have already seen countries put restrictions on exports to China. So, for example, the US and the Netherlands have done that with respect to the technology. In the UK, we now have investment screening in place to make sure that we don't have investment from concerning sources. We've also limited high-risk vendors in our telecoms network. So we've stopped Huawei having a major part of our telecoms network. So there has been action taken by individual countries. What I'm arguing for is a greater level of coordination between countries to make sure we're acting in concert, because I think that is much more powerful. I think it's unrealistic to say that the UK is going to be able to deal with this alone, or Australia is going to deal with this alone. But if you look at the combined economies of the G7 plus the EU, it's over half of the world's GDP. That is a powerful bloc, and we should use that consciously and coherently to deter bad behaviour and encourage good behaviour.
I mean, within the UK itself, your position obviously differs to that of the current Foreign Secretary, James Cleverly. He says that no significant global problem can be solved without China. He's listed climate change, economic instability, nuclear proliferation, and that to give up on dialogue with China would be giving up on addressing humanity's greatest problems. What do you say to that?
Let me be clear, I always support talking. So I fully support dialogue with China. I'm not arguing against talking to China. What I'm saying, though, is that we can't trust what China commits to. So if you look at the 1984 agreement on Hong Kong, that agreement has been trampled over by China. They've introduced a national security law in Hong Kong. And people's liberties in Hong Kong have been diminished. So what I'm saying is that we can't trust commitments that are made. And I think we have to be very careful on issues like climate change, where we've seen China continue to invest in coal-fired power stations. They've actually put more, I think they've authorised more new coal-fired power stations so far in 2023 than they did in the whole of 2021. I think we've got to take that with a pinch of salt. But I'm not arguing against talking to China. I'm saying the number one issue that we face is the threat to freedom and democracy, and that should be our priority.
You also say that the UK, now that it has entered the trade bloc, the CPTPP, should help block China and help Taiwan's entry. So from your time in, as Prime Minister, Foreign Secretary, also in the Trade Department, how much support is there for this in the UK?
Well, there is, I believe, huge support in the UK for taking a tougher stance on China. I've got no doubt about that. And I think opinion has shifted significantly since we went through the so-called golden era. Now, I think it's got further to go. And this is why I'm making these speeches. This is why my colleagues make similar speeches. This is why we need to make the case. Because I think people are waking up to the threat, but I don't think there is a full level of awareness about exactly what it is or how close it is. And one of the reasons that I'm so pleased the UK has joined the CPTPP is it's a really important geostrategic act to have countries that support the rules-based system working together. And we need more of that. And we need countries and territories that are part of CPTPP that support that.
You're the highest level British MP since Margaret Thatcher visited Taiwan in the 1990s to come here. Now, the Iron Lady, she's known for her toughness, but also caution. How do you think she would handle China if she were PM today?
Well, that's a very difficult question to answer. I mean,
in terms of the CPTPP,
I think it's a very difficult question to answer because we're in very different times from the times that we were facing in the 1980s. But if you look back at the challenges that we faced then, the challenges were industrial decline in the West, as well as a rising concern about the USSR. And what you saw then is a very strong alliance of democracies, including the US, including the United Kingdom, but also our allies like Japan and Australia, to challenge what the USSR were trying to do. So, as I've said, I think this is something that can't be solved by the UK alone. I think we can be part of it. But what we need is that strong sense of alliance, that there is more in common between free democracies than divide us. And we urgently need to work together because we're not winning the argument at the moment. There are fewer people living in free democracies than there were 30 years ago. There are countries who are now signing new agreements with China, whether those are security agreements or trade agreements, because they feel that is the way the wind is blowing. That is the reality of the situation we're in now. And if we don't do more today, I very much fear we will regret that inaction tomorrow. And that's what I'm saying.
Yeah, you said that the opportunity to confront China is now, because I think you said in 5 or 10 years that opportunity may not be here, because China would be even more powerful and even more economically integrated. Taiwan's legislative speaker, Yo Shi-kun, is in Washington now, and he said that if we don't take China's threat seriously, a dark future awaits all of mankind. What do you believe that future would hold?
Well, I'm a realist, but I'm also an optimist. And I do believe that freedom and democracy are the best way, and that we can win this argument and we can successfully transform our economies and we can successfully take on the economic coercion that we're seeing from China. But I do agree that the alternative is very dark. And I think it's very significant that it's people in places like Eastern Europe, the Baltic states and Poland who've had a recent experience of living under authoritarian regimes who are most exercised by the threat. And that is the message I think we have to get across more widely, that this is a real threat, and it is a threat to our way of life, and it is a threat to those things that we took for granted. At the end of the Cold War, I think a lot of us believed that freedom was forever, that we were on a permanent path to greater prosperity, that it was fine to cut our defence budgets because there was no real threat out there. That is clearly not a world we're living in now. And
you've made the link between, Europe and Asia, and currently China is saying that it can be a peacemaker in Ukraine. You mentioned, Eastern Europeans and how they understand the threat because of Russia. What do you make of China's peacemaking efforts? And there's something that you've said in a speech where you said that China mustn't be given leverage over Europe. What did you mean by that?
I'm very sceptical, to be honest. I mean, clearly, decisions about Ukraine are for the Ukrainian leadership and President Zelensky, and that's important. These are the people who are facing a truly horrific war and losing lives, huge human cost in Ukraine. So ultimately, it has to be President Zelensky's decision about any agreement he wishes to come to. What I'm saying, though, is that I am sceptical that involving China will help in this scenario. Ultimately, the best way to help Ukraine is to give them the weapons they need to be able to push Russia out of Ukraine. And that is the only way we're going to get to a long-term solution to end that conflict. And given what China has been doing in the Pacific, I'm very sceptical that they will be of great assistance in Europe.
Before you became PM, you were in favour of the UK selling arms to Taiwan. Are you still in favour of this? Do you believe that there should be more countries around the world, not just the US, to sell arms to Taiwan?
Well, what the US do is they provide arms to Taiwan, whereas what the UK does is we license equipment. Again, similarly to the economic side, what I think we should do is coordinate with our allies, understand what is needed to help the Taiwanese defend themselves. And yes, we should be prepared to allow that equipment to go to Taiwan. Taiwan is a free democracy. It has every right to defend itself. And I believe that making sure that it is able to defend itself helps prevent conflict. It's a deterrence.
The next UK general election must be held before January 2025. Now, you're only 47 years old. Do you plan to stand?
I like the way you say only 47, that's nice. I absolutely am planning to stand in the forthcoming election.
At the Heritage Foundation in Washington, you said that you had a major setback, but that you cared too much about the agenda to give it up, and that in the next few months you'll be setting out the ideas of how to take the battle forward. Can you tell me what you mean by that?
Well, what I mean is that, first of all, I care deeply about the future of freedom across the world. And one of the things I've been doing here in Taiwan is setting out what I think the free world needs to do to take on the challenge of a growing growingly aggressive China. I think that is one of the key things that we need to do, and I will carry on making that case and working with allies around the world to make that. And we're making progress, but we're not making progress fast enough. And the second thing we need to do is making sure that democracy and free societies work for people in our countries. Now, in Taiwan, there's been 3.2% growth for the last decade or so.
Including over the pandemic.
That is something that we look on with envy in countries like the United Kingdom and across Europe. And we need to get our economies growing. Because if we are going to challenge authoritarian regimes, we need to show that living in a free democracy gives opportunities and improves living standards. So the other issue I'm focused on is how do we generate that economic growth? And I will be saying more about that in due course.
Liz Truss, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you.
Thank you. Now, before that interview, Liz Truss gave a speech to the Prospect Foundation in which she further laid out her proposal for what she's calling an economic NATO. To discuss this and her visit, my guests are Lai I-Chung, Prospect Foundation President, Charles Wu, National Chengchi University, Professor in Diplomacy, and Lev Nachman, National Chengchi University College of Social Sciences Assistant Professor. President Lai, Charles, Lev, a very warm welcome to the show today. President Lai, let me start with you first. Obviously, you're the president of Prospect Foundation, which invited Liz Truss to Taiwan. Why did you do that?
Well, first of all, we do notice that during her tenure as a foreign secretary as well as a prime minister, she's the one that constantly raised about the importance of Taiwan as well as the security of Taiwan that should be aware and publicized by other nations, especially in Europe. And also we noticed that in G7, her along with the United States and Japan has been constantly asking other countries, more hesitant countries, to really highlight the importance and the security and stability of Taiwan. So we've decided that it is, we need to hear more about her view in person. And so that when she stepped down from Prime Minister, we believe that we need to find the opportunity to invite her. So we are very excited that when she accepted our invitation.
Okay, so a big supporter of Taiwan. Charles, were you surprised at the backlash against Liz Truss for her visit?
Actually, we are not surprised because as Taiwan becomes the focal points and as the Sino-US competition getting more intense, more and more international friends or this kind of key person, politician come to visit Taiwan. Especially this time, Truss visit Taiwan and she pointed out this kind of economic NATO, which I think is quite interesting because usually NATO we talk about is security-oriented. Well, economic NATO probably should want to argue that try to build kind of economic blocks within the East Asia or Asia Pacific to counterbalance against China's economic expansion.
It's actually not just Asia Pacific, is it? It's sort of, she talked about G7 plus maybe South Korea and
this is really interesting.
Australia.
We need more this kind of elaboration and arguments, what's called economic NATO means. Because this is a lot of counter arguments say, if it's NATO, especially during the Cold War, only the partners or parties within the NATO, they can trade each other. This is what we call the economic size of NATO. But I think Truss should probably want to expand these ideas, try to bring, for example, the European countries with East Asia or Asia Pacific countries into economic blocks.
Okay. President Lai, let's get into the heart of some of the criticism against Liz Truss. Obviously, there was from China, the envoy to the UK, said that her visit would only do harm to the UK. How do you read that?
I think that's just Chinese constant threat against other nations or other people when they pay attention and also want to build up a closer relationship with Taiwan. That's what Chinese usual tactic as well as statements trying to threaten both Taiwan and those individuals. This time, the Chinese ambassador to the United Kingdom talks about how that will harm the China-UK relations. Irrespective of the Liz Truss, right now, she's just an MP, not directly a person that held office. So this exaggeration and the extended threat, that means that in China, although they are very sensitive, but also that means that they are so fearful of those engagement, what might bring that to China, also to Taiwan.
Absolutely. Lev, I mean, there's a slight contradiction, isn't it? I mean, calling Liz, a failed politician, at the same time attacking her viciously, talking about Chinese state media here. Do you have any comments about that?
Yeah, so I think there's kind of 2 points to that. The first is that it doesn't matter which politician from the West comes to visit Taiwan, the PRC will always be upset. Doesn't matter how big or how small. So from that perspective, just as an MP, that's still upsetting from the PRC. Now, her track record as a politician, I mean, she was only prime minister for just barely over 40 days, and it can't really be overstated how unpopular she is back in the UK and kind of around the world. As an American, Americans don't know much about UK politics, but when we hear Liz Truss, we know that she's the one with the lettuce who didn't outlast the head of lettuce for more than 40 days. So she's not exactly an envoy of hopeful politics for a lot of people around the world. So it's one of those 2 things can sort of be true at the same time. Because she was withdrawn from her own party as prime minister, and the opposing sides in the UK also don't like her, I think that shows sort of a unanimous lack of support within the UK. Now, of course, the things she says about Taiwan and the comments she raises, I think we can evaluate those separately. The issue, though, is about the messenger. And I think perhaps we undervalue the importance of the messenger when it comes to these kinds of pro-Taiwan talking points. For example, if the goal is to try to raise the most awareness about Taiwan's situation as possible and try to rally as much support for Taiwan in the UK, having someone like Liz Truss, who may not be the most popular politician, I think we have to consider, does her saying these comments increase Taiwan's support, or what does it do to Taiwan's support in the UK?
Okay, Charles, would you like to comment on that?
I think she had some problems when she had, proposed the tax cut issues, also big government issues, and she cannot have the support from even from her party. And this is why she stepped down only at 45 days. The very important issue also she stepped down is because the drop of the British bonds, which make their economic downturns very seriously. So I think Truss, as a politician, she want resume or get her reputation back. So I think international politics and also the Taiwanese issues is one of very important kind of strategy for her to get her popularity again.
President Lai, however, there are benefits for Taiwan too, which is why you invited her.
Well, basically, she is one of the few at the very early stages when not a lot of people they're willing to talk about Taiwan, and in the higher positions that she's willing and very publicly express about the importance of Taiwan and raise awareness. So I think that although probably there are other British politicians, they also say similar things, but none of them ever in their positions in that capacity are willing to talk about this. So I think for better or worse, we should honor that. Especially we want to hear from her own personal view, why at that early stages she want to raise this profile. Second, the whole issue is about we believe that her record on Taiwan is impeccable. It's not about whether she is a better politician to deliver a message, even though there probably are other people that could be more popular than her. But the issue is that are those people are willing to talk about Taiwan, and not to mention about come to Taiwan to talk about those issues. So I think that really narrowed down to the very easy choices that why not inviting her? So the issue is not about why we invited her as a messenger, but why not inviting her? Especially we want to hear from her view. And also we believe that there's something due to those process internally. We like to know from her that what was the context of discussions at that time, that when she raised those things, who are the international leaders, their reactions. Many of those things we never got any opportunity to witness or find the insight. And her visit will provide us the opportunity.
I see. So an invaluable insight there for somebody who was, at that highest level of power. Lev, do you want to talk about takeaways that you had from her speech and from the event?
I think a lot of the aspects that she touches on, things like we need to be more supportive of Taiwan, the world needs to come together to support Taiwan. These are all good, positive things. I genuinely hope that more politicians in the UK take these messages to heart. Again, my biggest hesitation is that because it's coming from Liz Truss of all people, whether or not that will really resonate back home with not just her party, but with common citizens in the UK who will be voting on these kinds of issues as time progresses.
So how about on that global level, though, because she had just come from Copenhagen for the democracy summit there, and was also making speeches, having interviews there, all according to her, because she needs to get that message out. So these speeches and these events, would you say that they're useful?
I think anytime a politician, regardless of who they are, there is value in politicians raising Taiwan. I think we can accept that that is a good thing. I think it's just a matter of putting so much weight into this person. I think is perhaps our hopes are a bit overstated that Liz Truss, because she was formerly a prime minister, that she will be the one to really be able to lead the cause for Taiwan in the UK.
But my understanding is that she is one of many. She's one of a series of people that we've invited to Taiwan in order to help the cause.
I probably cannot reveal too much about the plan, but yes, she's not going to be the only person coming to Taiwan this year. China has also publicly said that the Prospect Foundation, now we have another crime about you, so you'll be registered again for another things. Oh, welcome. That because and every time you want to blackmail Taiwan, you want to isolate Taiwan, you make more our international friends want to come to Taiwan to comment on for whatever their motivation is. So we are going to invite more friends, more people, and you need a thick book in order to register all the crime that the Prospect Foundation has. But basically, what I'm saying is that China usually in the past they try to do two things about those visits. First, they like to threaten the visitors' country, and then they try to threaten Taiwan, both at the same time. But I wonder that how much of the marginal value they will continue to have, because we are going to have international visitors. We will not just stop at the Truss. We'll have others, and for China to the threat to continue to throw that out constantly, we'll have just more.
I should add, Taiwan has every right to invite anyone who wants to express support for Taiwan. That is perfectly good and reasonable. Taiwan needs friends, of course. I think it's just a matter of realizing that there's contexts behind every single one of the people that we invite. I think Mike Pompeo is a similar example where even though Mike Pompeo is a good friend to Taiwan, the political context of Mike Pompeo in the United States is different than how people see him in Taiwan. And the same is true of Liz Truss. Even though she may be warmly welcomed in Taiwan for her support for Taiwan, that doesn't erase the context in which she is coming to Taiwan, the background that she has, and as Charles pointed out, perhaps some of the other motivations she might have for suddenly changing her attitude on Taiwan.
Yep.
When I say
was it a sudden change of attitude on Taiwan?
Well, she wasn't very vocal about Taiwan until the last 2 years. Like many politicians in the world, they've discovered Taiwan, which is good. We value their support. But going from not saying anything about Taiwan to suddenly being Taiwan's loudest ally, I think there's a difference there.
Yeah, during those 2 years, while she was a foreign secretary and then later on become prime minister, especially during her and while she was a foreign secretary, when we look at other countries in G7, Germany, France, Italy, none of them, including Canada, none of them talk about it. But she was with the United States and also with Japan, try to convince everyone in that group that we need to make this statement into this G7 for whatever the remarks. I think for that alone, that already proved that she, whether no matter what her motivation is, but she has a track record and in comparison with others, and we should honor that. So that's my view. Another thing is that we have similar argument like this, not just about Pompeo, not just about Truss, but also how about the Abe Shinzo? He was after 1 year, and he suddenly departed from the Prime Minister of Japan, and then he was in abyss, that wandering in some wilderness in the politics. But still, we invited him to Taiwan, and we believe that he has a right cause. We stay with him for our friends. And of course, fortunately, that Abe was able to come back to Japan. So I'm not saying that we are going to beg on the Liz Truss for her to be back on the UK, but just the cause itself, I believe that it speaks for volume.
Charles, let's talk about one of the things that Liz Truss wants the UK to do is to designate China as a threat in the UK's integrated review. What sort of difference would this make?
I think this is one of kind of specialities of Liz Truss this time. He tried to bring the China's issue and also the threats image to her trip to Taiwan. But I mean, like what I said, there are also different voices from UK, from their domestic politics. For example, Tony Blair, he said there's UK really need to image or put China as a threat these arenas, or this is another way UK and China can frame their relationship. So like what I say, Liz Truss, he has his own personality and his own personal views. However, whether she can gather this kind of consensus within the UK domestic politics, still one very important thing she probably need to handle and conquer. And like what I say, the image of rivalry or threats is interactive. If UK, they start to use the policy as China as a threat, and I think in the future, probably China will respond as this kind of strategies, and probably it's not good for the UK and China relations in the future.
Lev, let's return to some of the things in Liz Truss's speech. She and also the interview that we just seen. She talked about this economic NATO. Essentially, it's a coordinating committee, and she referred back to the Cold War. And she said that at that time there was a coordinating committee that had a common policy on exports to the Soviet Union. So this is what she's recommending. Should there be any economic coercion by China? What do you think about that idea?
I think the idea of more economic trade with Taiwan is good, and there needs to be more direct trade.
Sorry, is economic a common policy towards China? So to set this up in advance so that China knows that there is this
Right,
structure.
I understand.
Okay.
What I'm saying is that because there's already so many trade deals, negotiations currently in existence right now, with the CPTPP being the UK's biggest concern, I would rather see more support for Taiwan's entrance into the CPTPP, this already existing framework, rather than focusing on yet another new economic initiative by countries around the world. I think even right now with the United States trying to create its now own separate framework, not including the CPTPP, I think there's more value in the UK, especially now that it is a member of the CPTPP, using its position, and if Liz Truss is really this new pro-Taiwan champion, using her position to maybe get Taiwan to the CPTPP, because that would be a huge benefit for Taiwan.
I mean, in the interview she did mention that. But it's a slightly different organization, maybe President Lai, a slightly different collection of people that she's talking about, or countries, isn't it? It's not about reducing tariffs. It's not one of those trade blocs.
I think that when in the last several years, due to the Chinese constant using the economy as a coercion tool, and people started to look at how we're able to deal with the Chinese economic weaponizing economy on those countries they dislike about certain behaviors. I think Lithuania is one such examples that the country in Europe started to realize that now Chinese threat is against one of us. Lithuania is one of the EU member, also the NATO member. So the issue about how to have economic Article 5. Article 5 basically is the security, like against one that is against everyone, so that they have to work together to jointly to fend against the threat.
Because they have that actually in the EU, and that is underway at the moment to protect Lithuania. So she's talking about it being beyond the EU.
But the whole debate, the whole discussion right now is that whether that, how much of the that it will be defensive in nature or offensive in nature. Defensive in nature, that is that, for example, in Lithuania, how we're able to help Lithuania to shoulder the cost that China placed on them. But offensive in nature, that will be when China against Lithuania, we are going against China, because against one will be against everyone. So we are going to retaliate. And those are two very different concepts. And it seems that right now the people are more in tune with the defensive, because they do not know how to do that, the collective offensive in terms of economy, and how would those stated interests will be affected. But I think the economic NATO sort of stand in contrast to the defensive in nature of response, because the defensive in nature response right now in EU, what it talks about is an anti-coercion instrument, and how that will be able to apply to this situation like Lithuania. But the economic NATO is a little bit stronger. Right. And I have to say that for her to voice out the economic NATO, that's a little bit different, or in my view, the side criticism against what she believes the inadequacy about the anti-coercion instrument that currently is in discussion within the EU.
And what's the appetite for something like this, President Lai?
I just do not know, because when the EU member, they talk about they're willing to talk about how to help the country that suffer to shoulder his cost.
So the defensive.
But not about the collectively we are going to retaliate against China, for example, in this case. That probably means that too much is at stake and too complicated, so that the country decided to we do something that will be easier to do.
I mean, Liz Truss in the interview pointed out that there are some countries that are already doing it. So obviously the US in terms of export restrictions, and she named obviously the Netherlands and Japan also coming on board.
Yeah, I think that's in the context about the high tech, for example, in semiconductors. So like Netherlands, the SML, along with Japan, Taiwan, and also the South Korea, as she cited as one of the successful examples for this. But then I think when you talk about the economic NATO, and when she cited about the coordination mechanism through something like Export Control Committee that during the Cold War, she's actually talking about that how we can learn from, in my view, how we can learn from that mechanism. Whether we resurrected Export Control Committee or we create something, but in a similar vein, like Export Control Committee, to have something that we actually can coordinate and talk about these issues.
Okay, well, we're going to have to wrap it up there. Apologies. President Lai, Charles and Lev, thank you very much for joining Taiwan Talks today. If you liked our show, please search for us on YouTube, give us a thumbs up and hit subscribe to our channel. Feel free to leave us any feedback in the comments section. See you next time.